I didn't find out because someone confessed. I found out because no one thought I was listening. It was early, too early for conversations meant to stay hidden. Morning light crept across the kitchen table in a pale, almost clinical glow. I sat there with my coffee, scrolling through my phone, waiting for a notification that usually came like clockwork. It didn't. No bank alert, no summary, no message. At first, I told myself it was nothing. A delay, a glitch. Things like that happen, don't they? Then I heard my name. Not spoken to me, spoken about me. My son's voice came from the other room, low and confident. My daughter-in-law answered him just as quietly, her tone measured, practiced. They weren't whispering because they were afraid of being heard. They were whispering because they assumed they wouldn't be. "She won't notice," my daughter-in-law said. There was a pause. Then my son replied, "Once everything's moved, it'll be easier. She doesn't need the details." They weren't asking about my money. They were planning it. I sat completely still. The coffee cooled in my hands. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. The shock arrived without drama, sharp, clean, and final. They spoke about timelines, about consolidation, about what would happen later, as if later were already theirs to define, as if the numbers they discussed weren't the result of my lifetime of work, just over $1 million. Savings, investments, a property sale years ago, money I had managed carefully, quietly, responsibly, money that was entirely mine. And there they were, mapping it out like a shared future expense. My daughter-in-law used words like streamline and simplify. My son nodded along, adding practical details, finishing her sentences. They sounded like a team, coordinated, aligned. I realized something then that made the room feel colder. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was rehearsed. When they finally noticed me standing in the doorway, their expressions shifted just enough to register surprise. Not guilt. Surprise. "Oh, Mom," my son said quickly. "Didn't hear you come in." I smiled, not because I felt warm, because I felt clear. "I was just getting some water," I said. My daughter-in-law returned the smile effortlessly. "We were just talking about organizing things, so you don't have to worry." There it was. The sentence that makes everything sound reasonable. "So you don't have to worry." I nodded. I said nothing more. I walked back to the table and sat down as if nothing had happened. They resumed their conversation, but the tone had changed. Lighter, safer, as if the danger had passed. They thought I hadn't understood. They were wrong. I glanced at my phone again. Still no notification. For the first time, the absence felt deliberate, designed. I looked at my son, at the child I had raised to be careful, honest, respectful. I looked at my daughter-in-law, who spoke with certainty, who carried herself like authority had already been granted, and I understood something painful and precise. They weren't planning with me. They were planning around me. That realization didn't break me. It steadied me. I didn't confront them. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations that would only be smoothed over with reassurances and half-truths. Instead, I listened. I noticed how my daughter-in-law used "we" when referring to decisions that weren't hers to make. I noticed how my son avoided specifics, relying on her confidence to carry the conversation. I noticed how easily they spoke of access and transfers, words that assume permission. Permission I had never given. When the room finally emptied, I remained at the table. The morning light had grown brighter, colder. My phone lay face up, silent. That silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about help. This wasn't about care. It was about control. And control, once revealed, never looks the same again. I finished my coffee and stood up, my hands steady, my thoughts organized. I didn't feel betrayed yet. That would come later. What I felt now was something quieter and far more dangerous to their plan. Awareness. They had assumed I was passive, distracted, unaware. They had mistaken my calm for consent, and from that moment on, I knew exactly what I would do next. Not loudly, not emotionally, just deliberately. When I think back, the memories don't arrive as warnings, they arrive as warmth. I remember the house before it felt heavy, when it was small, drafty, and always needed something fixed. I remember the afternoons when sunlight poured through the front window and my son sat on the floor with his toys, completely certain that I would always be there. I was. I raised him alone. There were years when the numbers barely worked. Years when I learned how to stretch a paycheck without letting it show. I worked longer hours, took on extra shifts, said no to myself so I could say yes to him. I didn't think of it as sacrifice back then. It was just motherhood. I saved slowly, quietly. A little from every check, tucked away where temptation couldn't reach it. I learned how to budget, how to plan, how to wait. I didn't chase risk. I chose stability, because stability was what my son needed. Every decision I made had him in it. The first house wasn't much, but it was ours. I remember carrying boxes inside with one arm while holding his hand with the other. He ran from room to room, already deciding where things would go. I watched him and told myself, this is enough. Over time, enough became more. The house appreciated. My savings grew. I made careful investments, not because I was ambitious, but because I was responsible. I thought ahead. I planned for emergencies. I planned for the future. I planned for family. When my son grew older, I never hid the truth from him. He knew I worked hard. He knew I saved. He knew I wanted him to have options I never did. I trusted him with that knowledge. Trust came naturally then. It didn't feel like a risk. It felt like continuity, like passing something forward. When he married, I extended that trust without hesitation. My daughter-in-law seemed capable, organized, confident. She spoke about finances with ease, about planning and structure and long-term thinking. I told myself that was a good thing. Family, I believed, didn't need walls. Family didn't need passwords. I shared details. Not everything, but enough. Enough to feel included. Enough to feel like we were moving in the same direction. I never imagined that information could become leverage. I look back now and see how gently it happened, how trust was normalized, how access became expected, how questions about my finances were framed as concern. Just so we can help, they'd say. I didn't notice how often help arrived without being asked. I didn't notice how often decisions were discussed near me instead of with me, because I was focused on something else. I was focused on believing that the life I had built would protect me, that love, once earned through years of effort, would naturally include respect. That belief shaped everything. It shaped how I spoke, how I listened, how quickly I dismissed doubts when they appeared. I didn't want to be suspicious. I didn't want to be the mother who questioned her own child. I told myself that trust was the reward for doing things right, and for a long time, that felt true. I remember family dinners filled with easy conversation, plans made casually, without tension, the comfort of knowing that what I had built would outlast me, would continue in good hands. I thought of my money not as power, but as security, a cushion, a legacy, something steady. What I didn't understand then was how quickly legacy can be redefined when ownership is blurred, how easily sharing can turn into expectation. Back then, when my son hugged me goodbye at the end of those dinners, I felt proud of the man he had become, proud that I had given him a foundation strong enough to stand on. I never imagined that foundation would someday be treated like common ground, open to claims I had never agreed to. If you had asked me then whether I trusted my son completely, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have said yes, without conditions, without fear. Because everything I built for my family. And I believed, truly believed, that family would never confuse trust with entitlement. Trust, I learned, doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. It stretches quietly, almost politely, until one day you realize it's been repurposed into something else. At first, there were only small shifts, things easy to ignore if you wanted to keep believing. A question asked twice, a suggestion repeated a little too confidently. My daughter-in-law began to frame conversations with certainty instead of curiosity. "We already looked into that," she'd say. "We thought this would make more sense," my son would add. I told myself that was partnership, that this was what adulthood looked like, collaboration replacing dependence. I didn't want to be the mother who hovered, who insisted on being consulted for every detail, so I stepped back a little. Just a little. That's how trust works when you value harmony. You make room. I remember the first time I didn't receive a statement I expected. When I asked, my daughter-in-law answered immediately, smiling. "Oh, we reviewed it already. Everything looks fine." Everything looks fine. The phrase landed softly, reassuring. I nodded and let it pass. I didn't realize I had just agreed to something without knowing what it was. Over time, conversations about money became more abstract, less specific. Decisions were described after they were made, never before. When I asked questions, the answers were brief, efficient. "Don't worry about that. It's taken care of. You don't need to stress over details." Stress. That word appeared often, used generously, like a justification. I had worked my entire life under stress. I had managed households, careers, emergencies, futures. Stress had never disqualified me from understanding my own finances, but I didn't say that, because trust also teaches you to doubt your right to object. I thought about the years when my son was small, how I explained things patiently, how I waited until he understood before moving on. I had believed that clarity was a form of care. Now, clarity was being withheld in the name of care. I still trusted him. I want that to be clear. My son had not changed overnight. He didn't raise his voice or issue demands. He deferred to her. He let her confidence speak for both of them. That, I would later understand, was its own decision. Family dinners continued. Holidays came and went. From the outside, everything looked intact. I was included in photos, mentioned in plans, spoken of warmly. But the role had shifted. I was no longer a participant. I was a beneficiary of decisions made elsewhere. I remember standing in the living room one evening, watching them discuss next steps for something that directly involved my assets. They spoke easily, referencing figures I hadn't heard, timelines I hadn't approved. I waited for someone to turn to me, to ask, to include. No one did. I told myself it was temporary, that once things were settled, we'd circle back, that trust sometimes requires patience. That was the story I kept telling myself because it was easier than questioning the alternative. The truth is, I wanted to believe that the life I had built had earned me lifelong inclusion, that my years of effort, of careful planning, of putting family first, would naturally protect me from being sidelined. I believed love came with memory, that they would remember who had built the ground they were standing on. I didn't yet understand that entitlement doesn't erase gratitude loudly. It replaces it quietly. By the time I began to feel the discomfort settle in, a vague sense of displacement, it was already normalized. I had been eased into the margins with such gentleness that resisting felt almost rude. That's how trust becomes a vulnerability, not because it's wrong, but because it assumes reciprocity. I think now about how often I chose peace over precision, how often I avoided asking hard questions because I didn't want to disturb the image of family harmony. I see that woman clearly, the one who believed that trust, once earned, was permanent. She wasn't foolish. She was loving. And love, when unguarded, believes that everyone values it the same way. I didn't yet know that I would soon have to translate trust into boundaries, that the legacy I built would need defending, not from strangers, but from those closest to me. Back then, I still believed that everything I had built, every dollar saved, every risk avoided, every plan made, would remain anchored to me by respect. I didn't know that respect, like trust, must sometimes be reasserted, not with anger, but with clarity. They didn't start with a demand. They started with a suggestion. It happened during dinner, one of those ordinary evenings that used to feel safe. The table was set neatly. The food was warm. Conversation moved easily until it didn't. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, measured. "We've been thinking," she said, glancing at my son. It might make things easier if we consolidated some accounts. Consolidated. The word landed gently, like it was meant to help something settle. My son nodded, not quickly, not eagerly, just enough to signal agreement. That way, he added, we can keep an eye on everything, less paperwork for you. Less paperwork, less worry, less involvement. I didn't answer right away. I focused on my plate, the familiar ritual of cutting food into smaller pieces. I had learned that silence often reveals more than reaction. What do you mean by consolidate? I asked finally. My daughter-in-law smiled. Just temporary, she said, until things are streamlined. Temporary. That word came easily to her. They said it was temporary. It never is. She explained how everything would still be mine, how my name wouldn't disappear, how this was simply about efficiency. She spoke as if the matter were already understood, already settled. I noticed how she didn't ask if I wanted it. She explained why it made sense. My son chimed in with reassurance. You've done enough, Mom. Let us handle this part. Handle. Another word that assumes transfer. I looked at him then, really looked. He avoided my eyes, focused instead on his glass, the edge of the table, anywhere but my face. That hurt more than the suggestion itself, because this wasn't just about money, it was about positioning, about who stood where when decisions were made. I nodded slowly. I'll think about it, I said. They seemed relieved, not because I had agreed, but because I hadn't resisted. After that night, the suggestions continued. Small ones, reasonable ones. My daughter-in-law began to speak more confidently about my finances, sometimes to me, sometimes in front of others. She used phrases like, we've already reviewed and we decided with unsettling ease. When I corrected her, she laughed lightly. Oh, you know what I mean. Did I? I started noticing patterns, statements arriving later than usual. Notifications that used to come directly to me now filtered through someone else. When I asked questions, answers came quickly, but without detail. Everything's fine. There's nothing you need to do. It's already taken care of. Taken care of. By whom? I asked to see statements one afternoon. My daughter-in-law hesitated, just a beat too long, before saying she'd send them later. She didn't. At dinner that evening, she brought it up casually, as if it were a favor. We really should get everything under one umbrella, she said. It's easier when one person manages things. One person. She didn't say who. She didn't need to. My son nodded again. I felt the tension tighten in my chest. Not sharp, not explosive, but constant, like a string pulled just enough to remind you it might snap. I realized something then. They weren't asking me to participate in a plan. They were inviting me to step aside. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that their confidence relied on my compliance. They spoke over concerns before I voiced them. They framed resistance as stress, questions as confusion. Gaslighting doesn't always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds helpful. I thought back to the woman I had been. Careful, organized, deliberate. I had managed households, careers, investments. I had made decisions under pressure without anyone guiding my hand. Now, suddenly, guidance was being offered where it hadn't been requested. I said less. I listened more. At the table, I watched how my daughter-in-law took the lead in conversations about my affairs, how my son deferred to her without discussion, how decisions were framed as conclusions rather than options. I realized the dinner table had changed. It was no longer a place of sharing. It was a place of presentation. They presented solutions. I was expected to accept them. That night, when I cleared the dishes, my hands shook slightly, not from fear but from restraint. I was holding something back, not anger, awareness. Because once you see the shift, from inclusion to control, you can't unsee it. And as I lay awake later, replaying the conversation in my mind, one sentence kept returning with uncomfortable clarity. They said it was temporary. It never is. After that dinner, the language changed. Not dramatically, not enough to start a fight, just enough to make me feel like I was always arriving late to my own decisions. Conversations began with conclusions. We already talked to the bank. We figured this would be best. It's taken care of? Each sentence closed a door before I reached it. I started noticing how often my daughter-in-law answered questions that weren't directed at her. When someone asked me about plans, about timing, about finances, she stepped in smoothly, confident, efficient. "Oh, we've got that covered," she'd say, smiling. My son would nod beside her, his agreement silent but visible. I was still there. I just wasn't needed. At least, that was the message. The first time it happened in front of someone else, I felt heat rise to my face. Not anger, embarrassment, a subtle, humiliating sense of being reduced to a detail. I opened my mouth to clarify, then stopped. Because the moment passed quickly, the conversation moved on, and correcting it would have made me look disruptive. That's how control works when it's polite. It doesn't push you out. It waits for you to step back. I began testing small boundaries, asking follow-up questions, requesting specifics. The answers came, but they were vague, rounded off, softened. "You don't need to worry about the numbers. We'll explain later. It's all under control." Control, the word echoed. One afternoon, I logged into an account I'd accessed for years. The password didn't work. I tried again, then again. Locked out. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law laughed lightly. "Oh, we updated some security things. You know how complicated passwords are now." Updated. Without me. She said she'd send the new information. She didn't. That night at dinner, she brought it up before I did. "We're really just trying to protect you," she said. "Scammers target older people. It's better if we manage access." Older people. Not me, a category I had just been placed into. My son added, "We just want you to be safe, Mom." Safe? From what? From my own judgment? I looked at him, searching for something familiar. He didn't meet my eyes. I realized then that safety had become the justification for exclusion. The tension tightened, not explosive, not loud, but persistent, like a hum you can't turn off. I started keeping notes. Not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Dates, phrases, changes in access, who said what and when. I didn't confront them with it. I was done reacting. At the table, I practiced stillness. I listened without responding. I let them speak, let them explain, let them assume. The more I said nothing, the more confident they became. That was the mistake. Confidence reveals patterns. I noticed how my daughter-in-law framed decisions as favors, how she spoke about my money as if it were a shared resource already assigned, how timelines were discussed without asking if I agreed to them. Once she said something that stayed with me. "When everything's under one account, it'll be easier later." Later. Not if, not when you decide. Later, as in inevitable. I understood then that this wasn't about convenience. It was about positioning for the future. And I was being quietly moved out of the center. I thought about all the times I had chosen not to press, all the moments I had stayed silent to preserve peace. I saw how that silence had been interpreted, not as dignity, but as permission. Gaslighting doesn't always deny reality outright. Sometimes it reframes it gently until you start wondering whether your questions are the problem. I stopped wondering. Instead, I observed. At dinner, my daughter-in-law spoke more. My son deferred more. Decisions came faster, with less explanation. They thought the shift was complete. They thought I had accepted my new role. What they didn't realize was that my silence had changed purpose. I was no longer staying quiet to keep the peace. I was staying quiet to see the whole picture. Because once you see it, once the pattern becomes undeniable, you stop asking whether something feels wrong. You start planning what to do about it. And as the dinners continued, as the conversations closed around me, one thought settled with absolute clarity. This wasn't temporary, and it wouldn't stop on its own. The first thing that disappeared wasn't the money. It was the emails. For years, statements arrived on the same days at the same times. Alerts popped up quietly on my phone. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation that things were where they should be. I didn't obsess over them, I didn't hover. I trusted the system. Then 1 month passed without a single message. At first I assumed it was a delay, a technical issue, something minor. I waited another day, then another. Nothing. I opened my laptop and logged into my email, scrolling carefully, deliberately. Spam folder, trash, archived messages. I searched for keywords I'd typed 100 times before. No results. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small movement feel loud. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, my own breathing. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Then I tried logging into the account directly. The password didn't work. I tried again, slower, more carefully. Still nothing. I felt a faint tremor run through my hands. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. This wasn't accidental. When I asked about it later that day, my daughter-in-law answered before I finished the question. "Oh, that?" she said casually. "We updated some things. You don't need to worry about that anymore." Anymore. I looked at her, waiting for an explanation to follow. It didn't. My son stood beside her, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't contradict her. He didn't add detail. He let the sentence stand. "It was confusing for you before," she continued. "Now it's simpler. Everything's handled." Handled. By whom? I felt the cold settle in, not sudden, not sharp, but spreading. The kind that doesn't shock you at first. It just stays. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at an inbox that had quietly been emptied of its relevance. Emails still arrived, newsletters, promotions, reminders, but the ones that mattered were gone. I wasn't locked out of the internet. I was locked out of myself. I thought about the word inheritance, how it's usually discussed in terms of the future, something that happens later, after decisions are no longer yours to make. But this felt different. This was inheritance happening early, without consent. The next time finances came up, I asked directly, "Can I see the statements?" I said. My daughter-in-law smiled politely. "There's really no need. We've already reviewed them." Reviewed, not shared, not discussed. Reviewed. "It's still my money," I said quietly. She nodded. "Of course it is." The words sounded right. The reality didn't. I wasn't allowed to see it. That was the part that hurt. Not just the exclusion, but the ease with which it was justified. How smoothly concern was used to explain away access. How quickly my right to information had been reframed as an unnecessary burden. I began to notice how often phrases like "for your own good" appeared in conversation. How often my questions were met with reassurance instead of answers. "You don't need to worry. We've got it covered. It's better this way." Better for whom? The house felt different then, familiar, but altered. Like furniture had been moved just enough to make you second-guess your memory. I walked from room to room, aware that something fundamental had shifted. I hadn't given permission. I hadn't agreed to step back. Yet somehow the decision had been made. That night, I sat in the dim light of the living room, my laptop still open, my inbox still empty of meaning. My hands rested on the keyboard, steady now. The shock had passed. What remained was clarity. They hadn't taken my money, they had taken my visibility, and I understood then that being excluded from information is the first step in being excluded from decisions. Decisions about money, about authority, about relevance. The room stayed quiet, but inside something hardened, because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a line crossed. What unsettled me most wasn't the silence, it was the consistency. Days passed, then weeks, and the pattern held. No statements, no alerts, no messages that acknowledged my role in decisions that still bore my name. When finances were mentioned, it was always in the past tense, already reviewed, already handled, already done. There was never a meeting, never a moment of agreement, just a steady narrowing of access. I began testing what I still had, not out of panic, but to understand the perimeter. I checked old folders, searched for archived emails, attempted secondary logins. Each attempt ended the same way, with a polite barrier that hadn't been there before. Locked, redirected, replaced. When I asked again, this time calmly, deliberately, My daughter-in-law answered with a practiced patience that felt rehearsed. "We're just trying to keep things simple," she said. "You get overwhelmed by details." Overwhelmed. The word hung there, soft and dismissive. I had balanced budgets during layoffs, negotiated contracts under pressure, made decisions when there was no margin for error. Overwhelmed had never been an adjective attached to me, until now. My son stood nearby, listening. When I turned to him, he shifted his weight and said, "It's not a big deal, Mom." Not a big deal. That was when the cold set in fully. Not anger, not grief, but resolve stripped of warmth. Because if it wasn't a big deal, there would be no reason to hide it. I realized then that this wasn't a series of small choices. It was a structure. One built carefully, politely, and without my consent. Concern had become the pretext. Efficiency had become the cover, and my absence had become the feature. I noticed how my daughter-in-law managed conversations with ease, how she framed updates as summaries, never invitations, how she answered questions before I could, how she used the word "we" to describe decisions that excluded me. I noticed how my son avoided specifics, how he deferred, not out of malice, but out of convenience. Silence is easier than resistance. That hurt more than any locked account, because it told me this wasn't just happening to me, it was happening with him. One afternoon, I sat alone with my laptop open, a blank document on the screen. I began writing, not feelings, not accusations, facts, dates when emails stopped, times when access changed, exact phrases used to justify exclusion. The list grew quickly. That's when it became undeniable. This was coordinated. The realization didn't break me. It cooled me. I understood now why explanations were always brief, why questions were discouraged, why reassurance replaced transparency. The less I knew, the easier it was to proceed without me. I thought about how often older people are told they should be grateful for help, how easily help becomes authority when no one challenges it, how quickly rights are reframed as burdens. I wasn't being protected. I was being managed. That night, the house was quiet again. I sat in the living room, the glow of the laptop reflecting off the walls, and considered my options. Confrontation would lead to denial. Emotion would be labeled confusion. Demand would be framed as stress. I needed something else. I needed leverage that didn't require permission. I closed the laptop and stood up, my hands steady now. The hurt was still there, but it had sharpened into something usable. Clarity. Because once you recognize that exclusion is intentional, you stop trying to be included. You start documenting. The next morning, I didn't ask for access. I didn't request explanations. I didn't raise the issue at breakfast. I made a phone call. Quietly, professionally. I asked about my rights. Not in theory but in practice, about visibility, about consent, about what happens when information is withheld under the guise of care. The answers were precise, calm, grounded in process. And for the first time since the email stopped, I felt something return, not control, direction. I looked around the room that afternoon, the same furniture, the same light, the same walls that had witnessed decades of my decisions. Nothing had changed physically, but everything had shifted, because I no longer wondered whether this was accidental. It wasn't. It was still my money. I just wasn't allowed to see it. And now that I knew that for certain, I knew exactly what had to happen next. That night, I didn't go to bed. Not because I was panicking, not because I was afraid, but because something had finally settled into place. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for weeks. No conversations behind closed doors, no reassuring phrases delivered too quickly, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock above the stove. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. For the first time, I wasn't replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I had missed or misunderstood. I wasn't asking myself whether I had overreacted or imagined things. I was done questioning myself. I started writing, dates first, the day the emails stopped, the day the password changed, the exact words my daughter-in-law used when I asked about it, the way my son looked at the floor instead of answering. I wrote everything down, slowly and carefully, as if I were preparing a record for someone who had never met us before. Because I didn't use emotional language. I didn't describe how it felt. I focused on what could be verified, what could be shown, not argued. That was the moment I understood something important. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning protection. I organized the papers I still had access to, old statements, property documents, records I had kept out of habit, never imagining they might matter this much. I placed them in neat piles, labeling each one with a steady hand. The order calmed me. Not because it erased what had happened, but because it gave me back a sense of agency. Each document was proof that I hadn't imagined my own life. I looked at the clock. Nearly 2 a.m. I made a cup of tea and let it cool while I read through everything again. No rushing, no dramatizing, just clarity. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't call my son. I didn't text my daughter-in-law. I searched for a number I hadn't needed in years. An attorney I had worked with once long ago when I first sold a property. He had been calm, precise, not easily impressed. That was exactly what I needed. I left a message, not emotional, not urgent, just factual. I need to ask some questions about financial access and consent. Please call me back. I hung up and felt no relief, only focus. I knew what would happen if I confronted them now. My questions would be reframed as confusion. My concern would be labeled stress. My insistence would be softened into something easier to manage. I wasn't going to give them that opportunity. Instead, I continued writing. I listed the accounts I knew existed, the ones I suspected had changed, the institutions involved. I noted who had spoken on my behalf and when. As the list grew, the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't chaos. It was design. I realized then how often older people are told they should be grateful for help, how quickly assistance becomes authority when no one pushes back, how quietly rights are set aside in the name of efficiency. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I turned the page in my notebook and wrote one question at the top. What are my rights? Not emotionally, legally. What happens when access is restricted without consent, when information is withheld, when decisions are made for someone who never asked? I wanted answers grounded in law, not family dynamics. By the time the clock reached 3:40 a.m., the notebook was full, the papers were stacked. My thoughts were clear. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen, the same room where meals had been shared, where conversations had once felt equal. The betrayal hadn't happened here. The awakening had. I wasn't planning to expose anyone. I wasn't planning to punish. I was planning to make sure this couldn't continue, that my name would mean access, that my silence would no longer be mistaken for surrender. As the sky began to lighten outside the window, I closed the notebook and placed it carefully on top of the papers. The clock ticked toward morning. I felt tired, but not weak, because for the first time since the emails stopped, since the decisions were made without me, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing, and preparation, I had learned, is the quietest form of power. The phone rang just after 8 the next morning. I was already awake. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't feel tired. The night had done its work. My thoughts were arranged, my emotions contained. When I answered, my voice was steady. He remembered me. Not in detail, not personally, but professionally. That was enough. I explained the situation the same way I had written it down. No adjectives, no conclusions, just facts, timelines, and access points that had quietly disappeared. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. "Did you give written permission for any of this?" I said no. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to matter. "That changes things," he said. He explained slowly, carefully, as if he were building something solid piece by piece, about financial access, about consent, about how concern does not override ownership, about how helping someone does not give you authority over them. I wrote everything down. Then I asked the question I had circled in my notebook hours earlier. What are my rights right now? The answer wasn't dramatic. It didn't promise revenge or confrontation. It offered something better. Clarity. I was entitled to full access, full visibility. Any changes made without my consent could be challenged. Any claims about my capacity required proof. Medical, documented, specific. Intentions don't matter, he said. Process does. That sentence stayed with me. Because intentions are easy to argue about, process is not. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table again, the morning light now fully filling the room. The papers were still there. The notebook was still open. I added a new section. Next steps. Not ultimatums, not threats. Steps. Request access in writing. Document responses. Schedule a formal review. No confrontation. No emotion. Just procedure. I understood then why people who plan quietly are often underestimated. Silence looks like compliance until it isn't. I thought about how easily my trust had been reframed as vulnerability, how quickly concern had been used as leverage, how my absence from decisions had been justified as kindness. It wasn't malicious in tone. That made it more dangerous. Later that day, I sent an email. It was brief, polite, direct. I'd like full access to all accounts currently under my name. Please provide updated login information by the end of the week. No accusations, no explanations, just a request that shouldn't have needed to be made. When the reply came, it was careful. We're just trying to make things easier for you. Easier, not lawful, not agreed upon. Easier. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded the message. I felt something shift then, not externally but inside. The fear that had crept in weeks earlier finally lost its hold. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't scrambling, I was aligned. That night I reorganized the house in small ways, not physically, emotionally. I stopped sharing details I didn't need to. I listened more than I spoke. I observed reactions. The more composed I became, the more unsettled they seemed. That was telling, because people who rely on control expect resistance or collapse. They aren't prepared for calm. I slept that night. Deeply. When I woke the next morning, nothing had changed on the surface. The same kitchen, the same routine, the same people moving through the house. But I was different. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning protection. Protection of my name, my access, my authority. And I understood now that protection doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, deliberately, until there's no room left for doubt. They thought my silence meant I didn't notice. They were wrong. I noticed everything. And the night I stayed awake, writing, documenting, asking the right questions, was the moment the balance shifted. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't change anything right away. That was the point. I let the routine continue exactly as they expected. Breakfast at the same time, conversations about ordinary things. No mention of emails, no mention of access, no mention of lawyers. Silence can look like acceptance when people want it to. I watched instead. I noticed how my son checked his phone more often, how my daughter-in-law spoke with a careful cheerfulness that felt slightly rehearsed, how decisions were still made quickly, confidently, just not announced. They thought the moment had passed. It hadn't. The alert came late in the afternoon. I was sitting alone in the living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, when my phone vibrated softly. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to catch my attention, a bank notification. I opened it slowly. Transfer initiated, pending confirmation. The amount wasn't small, not symbolic, not accidental. It was precise, deliberate. For a moment, I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but recognition. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an attempt. They thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't react outwardly. I didn't rush to confront them. I didn't raise my voice or send messages. I took a breath and read the details again. Origin account, destination account, timestamp. Everything was documented. I thought back to the conversations, the reassurances, the talk of convenience, the insistence that everything was temporary. I saw now how those words had paved the way for this moment. The transfer hadn't gone through yet. It was waiting. So was I. I didn't cancel it immediately. That mattered. Canceling would have erased the evidence. Instead, I took screenshots. I noted the time. I saved the alert. Then I sat there, calm, almost detached, listening to the house settle into its usual sounds. I wasn't angry. Anger would have rushed me. This required patience. When they came home later, nothing in my behavior changed. I greeted them politely. I asked about their day. I listened while my daughter-in-law talked about errands, schedules, plans that extended conveniently into the future. She never mentioned money. My son avoided my eyes. That told me everything. They were waiting to see if the transfer would complete. I excused myself early and went to my room. The phone stayed on the bedside table, screen dark but alive. Every few minutes I checked it, not anxiously, but deliberately. Still pending. I thought about how often entitlement hides behind familiarity, how people convince themselves they're justified because they're close, because they believe they know what's best. They didn't think of it as taking. They thought of it as moving something that was already theirs. That belief is dangerous. Midnight came and went. The alert remained unchanged. That was when I understood something else. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't planned for oversight. They believed access equaled permission, and permission, once assumed, is rarely questioned by the person benefiting from it. I picked up the phone and made another call, not to cancel, not to accuse, to ask one question. "Can you see this pending transfer?" I said calmly. The answer was immediate. "Yes." "Good," I replied. Please note that it was not authorized by me. There was no drama in the response, no surprise, just procedure. Procedure favors clarity. When I hung up, the pressure shifted, not outwardly but subtly. I felt it in the quiet, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath. They thought the trap was invisible. They didn't realize they had stepped into it themselves. I slept that night, not deeply, but enough. When morning came, the alert was still there. Pending, waiting, just like me. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't stopping something right away. It's letting it reveal itself fully. Morning arrived quietly. No alarms, no raised voices, just light sliding across the kitchen floor as if nothing had happened. They moved around the house with careful normalcy, too careful. That was the tell. People who believe they've done nothing wrong don't measure their steps. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law spoke more than usual. She filled the space with details that didn't matter: appointments, errands, plans for later in the week. She laughed at the end of her sentences, as if laughter could smooth the air. My son nodded along. He avoided my eyes again. I ate slowly, listening, my phone resting face down on the table beside my plate. I could feel the weight of it. Not physically, but symbolically. Everything they were pretending not to discuss was right there. They were waiting for confirmation. I checked the alert after they left the room. Transfer pending. Secondary authorization required. Secondary authorization? Mine. They had gone as far as they could without me. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought pressure on them, because now they had to decide what to do next. By midday, the tension had sharpened. Texts arrived that sounded casual but weren't. "Hey Mom, did you see a bank notification? Probably just a system thing. We might need you to approve something small. Nothing major." Small? Nothing major. The words were chosen carefully, like someone stepping around glass. I didn't respond immediately. Silence, I had learned, forces people to reveal their assumptions. An hour later, another message. "Did you get my text?" I answered then, just once. "Yes, I saw it." Nothing more. That afternoon they sat me down at the kitchen table. It wasn't framed as a confrontation. It was framed as a conversation. Gentle, reassuring, already decided. My daughter-in-law spoke first. "There was a transfer that needs your approval. It's just moving things to streamline everything." Streamline. Again. She slid the phone toward me, screen already open, finger hovering where my authorization would go. My son watched closely. They thought this was the moment, the final step. All the groundwork had led here, the softened language, the withheld information. the assumption that I would sign to keep the peace. I didn't touch the phone. Instead, I picked up mine. I turned it toward them. The screenshots were clear, time-stamped, documented. "This transfer," I said calmly, "was initiated without my consent." My daughter-in-law's smile faltered, just slightly. My son straightened in his chair. "I didn't authorize it," I continued, "and I've already noted that with the bank." The room froze. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my daughter-in-law recovered. "We were just trying to help," she said. "You know that." "Help." I nodded. Help doesn't begin without permission. My son finally looked at me. "Mom, it's not like that." I met his eyes. "Then explain why it was done without me." There was no answer that fit. Concern didn't explain secrecy. Efficiency didn't explain exclusion. Family didn't explain entitlement. The pressure they had applied for weeks shifted direction instantly. It settled back onto them, heavy and unavoidable. "I'm not approving this," I said, "and there won't be any future transfers without my written consent." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. They had expected resistance eventually, anger, tears, confusion. Something they could manage. They hadn't expected documentation. That was the mistake. The conversation ended without resolution, but the outcome was clear. The transfer was canceled. The accounts were flagged. The assumptions were exposed. That evening, the house felt different again, but this time the difference belonged to me. They moved carefully around me now. Conversations softened, decisions paused. The confidence they'd worn so easily was gone. Because once entitlement is revealed, it loses its power. I sat alone later, phone in hand, reviewing the final notification. Transfer canceled. No action taken. I felt no triumph, only confirmation. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought access meant ownership. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong on all 3 counts. And now, with the trap revealed and documented, I knew something else with certainty. This wasn't over, but the direction had changed. From here on, nothing would move without me. The meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown across the room. No one stormed out, no one cried. That was the part they hadn't prepared for. We sat at a long table, clean, uncluttered, deliberately neutral. My lawyer on one side, a representative from the bank on the other, my son and daughter-in-law across from me, and in the middle of the table a thin stack of documents. Nothing flashy, nothing emotional, just paper, the kind that doesn't care who you are related to. The bank representative spoke first, calm, measured, professional. There was an attempted transfer initiated without the account holder's authorization. No names yet, just facts. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly in her chair. She crossed her legs, uncrossed them, her hands folded, then unfolded. The lawyer continued. Because of that, all accounts have been temporarily restricted pending clarification of access and authority. Restricted. Not frozen because of confusion. Not paused because of concern. Restricted because of process. My son glanced at me, then away. He looked smaller there, seated across from legal language he couldn't negotiate his way around. The documents were slid forward. Account histories, access logs, timestamps. Each page answered a question that had been avoided for weeks. Who initiated the transfer? From which device? Under what credentials? No interpretations, no intentions, just records. I watched my daughter-in-law's expression change, not all at once but piece by piece. The confidence faded first, then the composure. What remained was something tight and brittle. "This must be a misunderstanding," she said. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He turned one page. "This shows the authorization request was sent to an email address not belonging to the account holder." Another page. "This shows previous access changes made without written consent." Another. "This shows a pattern." Pattern. That word settled into the room like weight. My son spoke then, his voice careful. "We were just trying to help. There was no bad intention." The bank representative nodded politely. "Intent isn't the standard we use." That was it. One sentence. Intent doesn't override ownership. Concern doesn't replace consent. Family doesn't negate financial law. No one argued after that. Because there was nothing left to argue with, the documents kept speaking. They showed when email notifications were rerouted, when passwords were changed, when access was consolidated, when authority was assumed rather than granted. Each page removed another layer of plausible deniability. My daughter-in-law went very still, not angry, not defensive, exposed. She had expected confrontation, something emotional she could deflect or manage. She hadn't expected a timeline laid out in black and white. I didn't say anything, I didn't need to. The lawyer turned to me briefly. Based on this, all attempted changes are void. Full access will be restored immediately. Additional safeguards will be put in place to ensure no future actions occur without your explicit approval. Approval, not assumed, not implied. Explicit. The bank representative added, any further attempts would be flagged and addressed as unauthorized activity. The room felt different then, not victorious, not loud, resolved. I looked at my son, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. He couldn't meet my eyes this time. That hurt. But it didn't weaken me. Because the truth was already on the table. They had planned quietly, assuming I wouldn't notice, assuming access equaled permission, assuming family bonds would blur boundaries enough to make it all pass unnoticed. They were wrong. And the proof didn't come from my voice. It came from the paper in front of them. When the meeting ended, the lawyer gathered the documents neatly. The bank representative stood and shook my hand. Everything is back under your control, he said. Control, not dominance, not retaliation. Control in its simplest form, the right to decide. As we walked out, my daughter-in-law didn't say a word. My son lagged a step behind. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because quiet justice doesn't announce itself. It lets the record stand. What followed wasn't loud. That surprised them. There was no shouting in the hallway, no accusations hurled as we left the room, no desperate explanations or emotional pleas. The collapse of their plan didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like silence. A heavy, unmistakable silence that settled after certainty replaces assumption. We stepped out of the building one by one. The glass doors closed behind us with a soft, final click. My lawyer walked beside me, already discussing next steps in a calm, measured tone. Safeguards, documentation, protocols. My son and daughter-in-law trailed behind. Not arguing, not defending. Just quiet. That silence followed us home. At the house, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered a room. Phones were checked, then put away. My daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen with deliberate care, as if the space itself had changed ownership, because it had. Not physically, but legally, unmistakably. The next email arrived before dinner. Full access restored, secondary restrictions removed, monitoring enabled, clear, unemotional, final. I read it once, then closed the laptop. I didn't forward it. I didn't announce it. They already knew. That night, my son knocked on my door. Not confidently, not casually, carefully. He stood there longer than usual before speaking. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. That sentence mattered more than anything else he could have said. Not I didn't know. Not I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would go this far. Meaning, he knew exactly what was happening. He just hadn't expected consequences. I didn't respond right away. When I did, my voice was calm. It went exactly as far as it needed to. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing something new. Something heavier than guilt. Limits. The next few days were uncomfortable in a way that couldn't be smoothed over. My daughter-in-law avoided direct conversation. When she spoke, it was clipped. Controlled. Her authority had vanished overnight, not because I took it back aggressively, but because it had never been hers to begin with. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet justice. It doesn't reclaim power. It reveals where power never belonged. The bank followed up again. New protocols were explained, new confirmations required, every safeguard documented, every access point clarified. I signed where necessary. I asked questions. I received answers. For the first time in weeks, nothing was withheld. My daughter-in-law watched from a distance as I reviewed paperwork at the table, carefully, unhurried, fully informed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't explain. She couldn't. The documents had already said everything. What shocked them most, I think, was what didn't happen next. I didn't punish. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand apologies. I simply resumed my role. That was enough, because once entitlement is exposed, it collapses under its own weight. I noticed how their plans changed. Conversations about the future became vague. Timelines disappeared. Decisions that had once been discussed confidently were suddenly postponed. They were recalculating. That was the real consequence. Not loss of money, but loss of assumption. They could no longer plan around me as if I were an obstacle to be managed or a signature to be obtained. I was present again, visible, decisive. One evening, my daughter-in-law finally spoke, not defensively, not apologetically, carefully. "We were just trying to make things easier," she said. I looked at her and answered honestly, "Ease without consent is control." She didn't respond, because there was nothing left to reframe. In the days that followed, I reflected on how easily this could have ended differently. How many people never notice the small shifts, the missing emails, the changed passwords, the decisions already made? How many are told it's for their own good and believe it? I had believed it too, until the paperwork told another story. That's the power of records, of timelines, of documentation. They don't argue, they don't accuse, they reveal. And once revealed, there is no going back to pretending. The house grew quieter after that, not tense, but adjusted. Boundaries had been drawn without shouting, enforced without cruelty. My daughter-in-law no longer spoke in absolutes. My son no longer assumed agreement. They had learned something they hadn't expected to learn. Silence does not mean ignorance, and kindness does not mean surrender. One afternoon, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where weeks earlier I had stared at an empty inbox, wondering how I had been erased so quietly. Now my phone rested beside my cup of tea. Alerts came through when they should. Access was complete, visibility restored, nothing flashy, just normal. And that was the satisfaction, not watching them fall apart, not hearing apologies spoken too late, but knowing that every plan made without me had been stopped, not by force, but by fact. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't fought. The documents had done all the talking, and in the end, that was louder than anything I could have said. After everything settled, the house became quiet again. Not the tense quiet from before. A different kind. The kind that follows after something breaks and is put back together, but not quite the same. I noticed it in the mornings first. No rushed conversations, no updates delivered as conclusions. Breakfast was quieter, slower, almost careful. No one spoke for me anymore. That absence felt strange at first. For weeks I had been interrupted, summarized, reassured out of my own sentences. Now, when questions were asked, they waited. Sometimes too long, sometimes awkwardly. That was the cost of boundaries. Silence fills the space where assumption used to live. I didn't announce new rules. I didn't gather everyone together to explain what would happen next. I simply changed how I participated. When financial topics came up, I spoke for myself. When someone tried to reframe my words, I corrected them gently. When suggestions were offered, I asked questions. Clear ones, without apology. No one resisted openly, but I could feel the adjustment. My daughter-in-law became quieter around me, not cold, just cautious. The confidence she once carried into every room had softened. She no longer said, "We've decided." She asked instead, sometimes. Other times, she said nothing at all. My son struggled more. He hovered in conversations, as if unsure where he stood now that the lines were visible. He wanted things to feel normal again, but normal had depended on me stepping back. That version of normal was gone. One afternoon, I installed a small safe in the house. Nothing dramatic, just a clean, solid box tucked discreetly into a closet. I placed the documents inside carefully: property records, updated statements, contact information. When I closed it, the click was soft, final. No one commented on it, but everyone noticed. The light in the house felt brighter after that, not physically, emotionally. The tension that came from not knowing who had authority was gone. Everything had a place again, and so did I. Still, there was sadness. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I grieved quietly for the ease we had lost, the assumption that trust would be honored, that help wouldn't come with strings. I thought often about how quickly care turns into control when boundaries are blurred, how easily someone's voice is replaced for their own good. That's what hurt the most. Not the money, not the attempt, but being spoken for. Being spoken for is not care, it's erasure. I realized then that boundaries aren't punishments, they're corrections. They don't exist to keep people out, they exist to keep relationships honest. In the evenings, I spent more time alone, not isolated, intentional. I read, I organized, I learned to enjoy the quiet without feeling like it meant something was wrong. Quiet can mean peace. The house adjusted around that truth. Conversations became shorter, more precise. Plans were discussed, not assumed. When something involved me, my name was used, not as a formality, but as a requirement. That was the boundary. No one represents me, no one manages me, not out of defiance, out of respect. I didn't say those words out loud. I lived them. The hardest part wasn't drawing the boundaries, it was living with them afterward. Boundaries don't slam doors, they rearrange rooms, and when rooms change, people don't always know where to stand. I saw it in the way my son hesitated before speaking now, how he would pause, measure his words, then sometimes say nothing at all. He wasn't angry, he was recalibrating. That hurt more than resistance would have, because resistance would have meant he still believed there was something to fight for. Silence meant he was learning a new map, and I wasn't sure where I fit on it yet. My daughter-in-law adapted differently. She became efficient in a quieter way. She stopped offering unsolicited updates. When she did speak, it was precise, contained. We were polite, civil, functional, but something intimate had been lost. Not trust exactly. Something simpler. Ease. I missed the ease. I missed believing that care and respect were the same thing. Some evenings I sat alone in the living room, the house washed in soft light, and let myself feel the sadness without trying to fix it. Not everything needs repair. Some things just need acknowledgement. I acknowledged that our relationship had changed, that it would never return to the version I once thought was safe. And that was okay, because safety built on silence is fragile. One afternoon, I updated my documents again, not because I had to, but because I could. I clarified roles, named representatives, set limits in writing. When I finished, I placed everything back in the safe and locked it. I felt no fear closing that door, only certainty. The next time finances came up in conversation, my daughter-in-law stopped herself mid-sentence. She looked at me, not apologetically, not defensively, inquiring. I answered directly. No explanation, no justification. That moment mattered, because boundaries work when they're respected without being enforced. I realized then that independence isn't loud. It doesn't need announcement. It shows up in small, repeated acts, being asked instead of told, included instead of managed. There were still quiet moments that felt heavy, still afternoons when I wondered whether asserting myself had cost me something precious. It had. But it had also saved something essential, my voice. The house felt like mine again, not because I owned it, but because I was present in it fully. Nothing happened without my knowledge. Nothing moved without my say. I didn't need to watch closely anymore. Trust, when rebuilt properly, includes verification. That's not cynicism. That's maturity. I thought about how many people confuse boundaries with distance, how often they believe drawing a line means pushing someone away. But boundaries don't separate, they define. They tell others how to love you without harming you. I wasn't angry anymore, I was steady. That steadiness settled into my routines, my tone, my expectations. It didn't make me colder, it made me clearer, and clarity, I learned, is kinder than silence. When I went to bed at night, I slept without replaying conversations, without wondering what had been decided without me. The peace arrived quietly, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. The morning came quietly. No announcements. No turning point anyone else could see. Just light. I stood on the front porch as the sun lifted itself over the edge of the neighborhood, soft and unhurried. The air was cool, clean. The house behind me was still. For the first time in a long while, nothing in my life felt like it was waiting to be reviewed. No one needed to approve my decisions. No one needed to confirm my clarity. No one needed to manage me. That realization didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with calm. I thought about how much energy I had spent, over years, not weeks, making sure others felt comfortable, making sure I wasn't too firm, too direct, too independent. I had learned early that being agreeable kept things peaceful, but peace that requires shrinking is not peace, it's surveillance. Now my days were quieter in a different way. I paid my bills when I wanted. I reviewed my statements without explanation. I scheduled appointments without consulting anyone, not out of defiance, out of ownership. Money, I had learned, is rarely just about numbers. It's about authority, about who is allowed to decide, about who is trusted with the future. For a while, my life had felt like it was under evaluation, as if my competence needed to be constantly proven, measured, discussed. That ended the moment I stopped participating in the test. I chose myself. That choice didn't isolate me, it centered me. Relationships adjusted around that center. Some became quieter, some became more respectful. None were confused anymore about where I stood. That mattered. I moved through the house differently now. Not cautiously, not defensively, comfortably. The documents were secure, the boundaries were clear, the routines were mine. I didn't need to explain that to anyone. The most surprising part was how little I needed after all the noise stopped. No validation, no apologies, no dramatic resolution, just agency. Just mornings like this one, standing in the soft light, breathing in the day, knowing that every choice ahead belonged to me. For the first time, my life wasn't under review. It was simply mine. I learned something important after everything settled. Freedom doesn't feel loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand witnesses. It arrives quietly, the way confidence does when it no longer needs permission. In the days that followed, life didn't change dramatically on the outside. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. The same streets, the same mornings, the same porch where I watched the light move across familiar ground. What changed was how I occupied my own life. I stopped explaining my choices before anyone asked. I stopped anticipating objections that no longer belonged to me. When I made decisions, I made them fully, without rehearsing reasons, without checking whether they would be acceptable to someone else. That alone felt like breathing deeper. I realized how often I had confused independence with loneliness. How I had been taught, quietly, repeatedly, that being managed meant being loved, that oversight meant care. But care that requires control isn't care. It's fear wearing a gentler name. Now, when I reviewed my accounts, it wasn't to prove anything. It was to stay informed, because informed is how I choose to live. When I planned my days, I did it for myself, not around someone else's expectations. The boundaries I set didn't harden me, they softened me. Because I wasn't guarding anymore. I wasn't bracing for the next question, the next suggestion, the next, "we'll handle it." The tension that had lived in my shoulders eased, replaced by something steadier. Trust, properly rebuilt, feels like space. Space to think, space to choose, space to be wrong and still be respected. I thought about my son sometimes, not with bitterness, but with honesty. About how easily roles blur when comfort replaces accountability. About how silence can be mistaken for consent. I hoped he learned something from this. Not about money, but about boundaries. And my daughter-in-law, about how quickly authority borrowed without permission evaporates under scrutiny. I didn't need apologies to move on. Understanding was enough. On one quiet afternoon, I sat on the porch again, tea warming my hands, the neighborhood humming softly in the background. A breeze moved through the trees, unbothered by anything that had happened here. I felt grateful, not for the conflict, but for the clarity it forced. Because clarity is a gift you can't receive without discomfort first. I no longer lived as if my life were under review. I no longer felt the need to demonstrate competence or justify independence. I trusted myself, and that trust changed everything. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever felt managed instead of supported, spoken for instead of heard, know this: you don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your life. You don't need to argue to be respected. You don't need permission to choose yourself. Sometimes the quietest decisions are the most powerful ones. For the first time, my life wasn't under review. It was simply mine. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to set boundaries later in life, or choose independence after being underestimated, stay with us. There are more stories like this. Stories about quiet strength, about choosing yourself, about finding peace without burning bridges. Subscribe if you want to hear them, because it's never too late to take your life back, calmly, clearly, and on your own terms.